Well, extremely warm welcome. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the sixth in the Currie Lecture series here in the Sir John Cass Business School, City University, London. For those who don't know City too well, I should say a bit about us by way of background. We're the only university in London to be both committed to academic excellence and focused on business and the professions. And we're an integral part of the City of London with the Lord Mayor as our Chancellor. We were established in 1894 and we've come a long way since gaining university title in 1966, and we're now positioned in the top 5% of universities in the world. We have about 17,000 students, about a quarter are from outside the EU and about a third are postgraduates. And following the development of our strategic plan, which seems like a long time ago now, but it was only 2 years ago, we've been investing and working hard to take our place among the world's leading universities. And the first investment of several was to invest in 140 leading academic staff from around the world, and they're now with us, and they've been truly transformational in many areas of the university. And although it's still early days on this journey for City, we can see that some changes are starting to bear fruit. Our student satisfaction is increasing. In fact, we were the most improved university in England in terms of student satisfaction in the last student survey. Our undergraduate entry qualifications are increasing. Our research grants and contract income is increasing. Our rankings in the various league tables, Times and so on, are increasing. And we've increased the alignment between the research and teaching we do and the major issues of the day, whether they're commercial or scientific or technological or, of course, financial. I'll now move on and say a few words about the Currie Lecture series, because it started in 2008 and it's maintained a tradition of very prestigious speakers, starting with Sir Callum McCarthy, then Alistair Buchanan, Philip Collins, Dr. David Bennett and Martin Wheatley. And this evening the Currie Lecture will be given, most appropriately of course, by Lord Currie of Marylebone. He's known to, I know, several people here. I picked that up when I was outside before the lecture. He's chairman of the Competition and Markets Authority, which assumed its full functions and powers on the 1st of April this year. He's also governor of the Institute for Government and a member of the board of the Dubai Financial Services Authority. In his early career, Lord Currie was founding chairman of Ofcom and, of course, the dean of Cass Business School from 2001 to 2007. David is a major force in the development of Cass, and much of the school's standing among the top business schools in the world is due straight down to his motivational leadership, direct style, and considerable energy. He took great personal interest in the design of the building. In fact, just before I came up on stage, we were talking about his involvement in the choice of the chairs, which hopefully are extremely comfortable. But one of his notable initiatives, apart from the chairs, was to move the cafe from where it was hiding on the third floor to its current position, right at the front of the building, right by the entrance. And it created that buzz, that feel that you get when you come into Cass, and I hope you felt that when you came in tonight. The Currie strategy was for Cass to be world-class and the intellectual hub of the city. So it's very good to see him returning here tonight to this hub to engage with one of the really important issues facing the city, and that is, of course, regulation. Professor Volpin will now add a few words on behalf of the Dean of Cass Business School. So, Paolo?
Yes, thank you. So, good evening. evening, and welcome again to the Currie Lecture 2014. And I'm Paolo Volpin, and the head of the finance faculty at Cmas Business School. And my task is just to welcome again Lord Currie on behalf of the school, and I will be very brief, I promise. So over the last 10 years, Cmas Business School has been on a significant upward trajectory. We have grown to more than 3,600 students across a portfolio of undergraduate, masters, MBAs, and PhD programs. We have invested strongly in faculty and recruited, for instance, in the last 2 years, 30 new academics. Last year, we have opened new premises on Aldersgate Street to provide our executive MBA and executive education client with dedicated state-of-the-art facilities. As an indication of the achievement of the school, recent rankings have placed our finance research third in Europe, our banking research second in Europe, and our actuarial science research second in the world. In addition to this, and we are very proud of it, our research is ranked second in Europe for its impact on the real world of business practitioners and policymakers. And all this would not have been possible without Lord Currie. So as the Dean of Cmas Business School, or City University Business School, as was called then, he was instrumental, as mentioned already, in securing us all the resources we needed to start in our growth, not the least this building, and helping us on the way. For all this, we are truly grateful to you. So the format of this evening is as follows. So Lord Currie will give a presentation on, as you can see, the case for the British model of independent regulation 30 years on, which will be followed by a Q&A session. And after that, there will be an opportunity to network over drinks in the Milling area just outside the auditorium. So distinguished guests, please welcome Lord Currie.
Well, thank you very much for those over-generous introductions. It's great to hear the progress the university and business school have made, and it's especially good to think how well it's been doing since I moved on. But really, it's very impressive, the range of hirings and other things that have been achieved. So it's a great pleasure to be back to give this sixth lecture in the series. I was greatly honoured when the university created this in my name, reflecting my interest both in regulation and my interest as an academic and practitioner. To have Currie giving the Currie Lecture is the sort of lecture equivalent of a selfie and needs a little bit of explanation. A couple of years ago, I said to Steve Haberman, the Dean, that I would give one of the lectures in the series. I had in mind that after 20 years in the regulatory fray, having stepped aside, I'd give my retrospective summing up of the regulatory field and the factors behind regulatory success. I didn't really imagine that I would be following in the footsteps of many distinguished economists and lawyers and building and leading the UK's new competition agency. But it was not long after that suggestion to Steve that I was asked to chair the Competition and Markets Authority, almost exactly 10 years to the day that I'd been asked to chair Ofcom. And so over the past year and a half, I've been in the thick of it, overseeing the CMA's formation, and we have a number of colleagues, including my chief executive here tonight, the formation from the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. And that came to successful fruition last month when we opened our doors for business. But with your indulgence, what I'd like to do, I will come to the CMA and our ambitions for it, but I'd like to stick to my original intent and talk more broadly about the state of regulation and the role of markets. And because of that wider canvas, what I'm saying this evening shouldn't really be attributed to the CMA, but seen as the reflections of a long-in-the-tooth pensioned-off academic who's had the privilege in his career to work in business and government, often explaining business to government and government to business, And in that process, I've been able to observe directly many sides of some complex economic phenomena. My key theme tonight is the interaction between politics and the UK system of independent regulation, and the danger that this system is at risk from greater political intervention. There is a strong and welcome degree of political consensus for the principle of independent regulation of markets that was reflected in the smooth passage of the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act 2013, which established the CMA. However, there's also growing pressure on politicians to intervene in a range of markets to achieve particular ends, whatever the merits of the individual intervention. And such interventions taken together could damage the overall regulatory regime. And I want to explain why, if the regulatory system were to succumb under this pressure, that would be bad for consumers, businesses, the economy, and ultimately, I believe, the vast majority of politicians. I think we're getting a bit of an echo on this. Can you is the mic working adequately? I'm hearing a sort of bit of feedback. I could. You come forward. It's when I go back. Yeah. Okay, I'll try to. Let me start by reflecting broadly. In the past 5 or so years, the world economy, particularly in Europe and the US, has gone through a very major financial and consequently economic crisis, the worst since the 1930s. And that's had severe impact on businesses and individuals. Many businesses that seemed perfectly viable have gone to the wall. Many individuals have lost their jobs. Those entering the labour market for the first time have found it very difficult to find a job with severe consequences for their long-term life chances. And many of us who have been much less affected have nonetheless had to wind down our expectations about the future. Not surprisingly, against this background, public faith in the efficacy of markets has fallen. And many more are willing to contemplate government interventions in the operation of market forces. That's been reflected in the discourse of politicians, with price and rate caps being reached for across the political spectrum, a revival of public interest concerns about international mergers, and even calls for nationalisation. Is this a healthy correction to the overblown faith in markets that preceded the financial crisis, or is the pendulum swinging too far towards government intervention? Now, there are, of course, good intellectual reasons for scepticism in the operation of the market. General equilibrium theory is taught in economics courses up and down the country, and I was raised at the University of Birmingham on the classic treatises by De Broglie and Arrow and Hahn. And its simplified essence is taught in schools. It shows how the market can deliver a Pareto optimal outcome, which, if one is intrepid enough to define a social welfare function, could be socially optimal on the assumption of appropriately redistributive taxes. But as Frank Hahn used regularly and powerfully to say, the analysis relies on very stringent conditions, lump sum taxes, the full panoply of forward markets, and very specific aggregation assumptions, not least to exclude the possibility of increasing returns. The international trade theory, I learned at the same time, showed the conditions under which free trade delivered optimal outcomes between countries, but these too were stringent, needing to exclude a whole number of phenomenon that might more realistically arise. And the economies of scale, which Paul Krugman showed to be absolutely essential in explaining trade between countries with similar industrial structures. So you can turn all of this analysis around and use it to say that the market will only deliver optimal outcomes under highly limited and implausible conditions. And that's why the Austrian school view of markets and competition as a process of rivalrous discovery with continual change and evolution, rather than embodying the concepts of optimality and equilibrium, is so much more helpful. The same point applies, one could argue, to the seminal work of Ronald Coase, often cited by market proponents wishing to argue against government policy interventions. His insight that refining property rights can help to resolve market failures arising from externalities is a critical one. But Coase was a pragmatist and recognised that transaction costs could well make coordinated action by scattered individuals infeasible, leaving scope for government to influence outcomes for better or worse. One can argue the same in the field of macroeconomics. The rational expectations revolution led to a major rethink of how intelligent agents respond to macroeconomic phenomena, including government policy interventions. Much of the thrust of the literature was to show how government policies were ineffective because of the adjustment of expectations to the new policy. But that's only true in very specific circumstances, essentially the same aggregation and other conditions required for general equilibrium theory to show the efficacy of markets. And if I may indulge in a little personal footnote, I, with colleagues, was analysing the characteristics of control rules in dynamic macroeconomic models with a view to identifying simple, robust policy rules. But with a view to making the assumptions more realistic, we moved to analyse the consequences if agents had less than perfect information about the economy. And with a succession of wet towels, we were able to derive an analytical solution in the restricted case where agents shared the same partial information set. But for the cases where the information sets differed, we had to resort to computational methods with the deployment of very considerable computer power. And that was, if you like, a reductio ad absurdum. The notion that agents were acting as though they could solve this complex calculation was simply not tenable. And if instead you assume plausibly that they adopt a simple heuristic, a la Kahneman and others, then only in very simple and unrealistic models is there any possibility that learning will lead to the rational expectations outcome. So we'd essentially gone down a fascinating intellectual blind alley. Thomas Piketty has hit the headlines recently with a somewhat different macroeconomic perspective on wealth accumulation. And he reminds us that if rates of return exceed the rate of growth, the historically normal state of affairs, then the natural laws of capital accumulation mean that wealth distribution will tend to become more unequal over time, a trend that was interrupted in the 20th century by the wealth appropriated and destroyed by 2 world wars. But that increasing inequality of wealth distribution raises important questions about income and wealth concentration, as well as industrial concentration, that may be used to justify government intervention. Market processes may well generate major net benefits, but if these benefits are not shared, their fairness may be questioned and noisily amplified in the discourse, in the political discourse by the media. And that's all the more the case when the authorities take actions in the interests of market stability, which have at least the appearance of bailing out guilty parties. You may have read Tim Geithner saying in Saturday's Financial Times, referring to the sense of deep unfairness, of rewarding the unjust, rewarding the arsonist. Those are all arguments for challenging the outcomes of market processes and provide the possible basis for government intervention to improve matters. But of course, there are equally compelling arguments why such intervention may not help. The extreme case of central planning has been discredited by history. A fact that I don't much advertise is that my first qualification in economics was a master's degree in national economic planning, which I studied at the University of Birmingham, having abandoned a PhD in mathematics. Much of the course was essentially mathematical programming, relatively trivial after Gödel's theorem. And so I had plenty of time to attend a wide range of postgraduate economics courses that gave me my real economics education. I remember musing on the way to the course interview as to how on earth central planning could coordinate the diverse range of economic activities that I was observing from my train window. The nearest answer came in the proof of the double decomposition theorem, showing with great pride the conditions under which an optimization problem could be decomposed into a simple high-level optimization, providing the parameters for a subsequent subset of subsidiary optimizations, justifying the planning subsidiarity then practiced in Poland and Yugoslavia. Of course, the conditions for such a decomposition were as stringent and unrealistic as the Arrow-Debreu conditions. Peter Wiles, a professor at the LSE, came to Birmingham to regale us with entertaining stories as to the horrors of Soviet planning, including the inability or unwillingness of the planners to get loo paper to Leningrad over a 20-year period, as well as charging the Indian state planners with killing through starvation more people than Stalin. Of course, long since justly dead, reinforced the initial insight of my train journey. And of course, the Soviet Union was brought down by the failures of planning, and as an illustration, the comprehensive enterprise-level data available in East Germany after the Berlin Wall came down shows that 90% of enterprises were unprofitable at world prices, and some 40% were actually value destroying. That is, the value of the raw materials, excluding capital and labour, going into the production process exceeded the value of the final product. The sausage coming out of the factory was smaller than the one going in. Those lessons, I think, are well learnt, and few, if any, argue for a return to central planning. Although, just as an aside and a point that I won't develop, it is possible to argue whether the lesson has been sufficiently learnt. After all, the huge, sprawling multinational companies, larger than many national economies, are the last bastion of central planning, and may, for example, in the case of the complex banks, be too large to manage, as was perhaps revealed in the financial crisis. So, with that sort of theoretical throat clearing, we're left, unsurprisingly, in the common sense middle ground of recognizing that market outcomes may not always be for the best, though there is no practical alternative to the market. Market failures may be rife and may be susceptible to government intervention to improve matters, but as Cmas argued, we must be as alert to government failures as market failures. And it's very easy to find examples of government failures. I've just flicked through the wonderful recent book, The Blunders of Our Government, by Tony King and Ivor Crewe. And I'd just like to offer you three examples of my own. I was brought up on an early study of the post-war business cycle by J.C.R. Dow, who showed that the fine-tuning of the business cycle had been mildly destabilizing, adding to rather than reducing volatility, a conclusion drawn from and relevant to the immediate post-war era of relative macro stability, fixed exchange rates and limited capital mobility. Fine-tuning, trying to smooth out mild business cycle fluctuations, was problematic for a number of reasons. But that doesn't necessarily vitiate course tuning of major economic fluctuations, and indeed, we've just passed through an episode where government intervention in the form of quantitative easing or outright monetary transactions has almost certainly averted a repetition of the failures of the 1930s chronicled so effectively by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. In the field of international trade, the literature on effective protection shows the unintended consequences of putting in place import tariffs in response to political lobbying. The immediate post-war patterns of import tariffs was very varied, with a nominal tariff rate typically rising through the production chain, with lower protection on raw materials and much higher rates on finished products. The consequence was twofold. First, the effective or real degree of protection was hugely in excess of the nominal. Nominal tariffs of 20% could easily generate real effective rates of 100%. So that what might have been intended as a helping hand to domestic industry amounted to solid protection and feather bedding. Second, variations in nominal tariffs led to great variation in the real level of protection accorded to different domestic sectors, leading to inefficiencies in the allocation of resources and investment. Europe learned that lesson quickly and dismantled tariffs. Latin America was a slower learner and suffered from lost economic growth. A high price was paid for muddled government intervention. But the correct lesson is not that all protection is necessarily harmful. Paul Krugman's work shows at a theoretical level that this need not be so, and the development history of many parts of the world show the benefits of some protection in the early stages of industrialization. But the key to success is keeping it simple, to avoid unanticipated side effects, and avoid piling intervention on top of intervention, which will assuredly result in poor outcomes. This was very much in my mind when I took my role at Ofcom in 2002. An early challenge was our approach to telecoms regulation and BT. And we inherited from Oftel somewhere between 150 and 300 separate regulatory interventions, depending on how you characterize them, into BT's business. Yet although there were very many companies in the telecom space, almost all of them were minnows and wholly dependent on the regulatory drip feed. What I think had happened was the regulation had grown in a somewhat non-strategic way. While each intervention could be rationalized in its own terms, the unintended consequences of piling regulation on regulation were not properly considered. And at my first very early meeting with Christopher Bland and Ben Verweyen, when I was the only person in Ofcom, I said we had so many hooks into BT that they could scarcely move without our say-so. But that despite this, we weren't achieving our key policy goal of effective competition. And I said that there must be a better way. BT and the new Ofcom ran with that germ of an idea, and the result was functional separation, the creation of OpenReach, and the requirement for equality of access. Competitors to BT Retail were given equal access to BT's core network as BT Retail itself. And the result was the takeoff of the UK broadband market, appreciable deregulation, and the emergence of genuine scale competitors to BT. Each of these examples, I think, illustrates a key lesson. Because of the risk of government failure, government intervention needs to be very carefully limited and focused on tackling the most egregious market failures. The intervention may not be simple. Functional separation was a technically complicated intervention, but it needs to be focused. And a key difficulty for government policy making is that lobbying of government by interest groups encourages the opposite. Interventions that are less focused and wide-ranging, aimed at satisfying a wide group of diverse interests. And this brings me, finally, to the central focus of this lecture. If we're to design careful government interventions in markets, what's the merit of government giving powers to an independent regulator, whether interest rate setting to the Monetary Policy Committee or price setting powers to a sector regulator? And what safeguards are needed to ensure that this arrangement works satisfactorily? And what's the nature of the independence and how is it exercised and protected? There are a number of reasons why such delegated arrangements make sense. First, there's the argument I've just developed, that delegation in this way is more likely to deliver focused, effective interventions because it will be less susceptible to diverse lobbying influences. Second, as in many areas of life, there's advantage in clear delegation within a well-defined and contained framework. This facilitates greater transparency around the rationale and process for decision-making, improving predictability and reducing uncertainty. Third, independent regulation may allow a greater commitment to beneficial long-term objectives that it's hard for government itself to deliver on. That was the motivation for delegating interest rate setting to the Monetary Policy Committee, with a clear and transparent objective to pursue low and stable inflation. Before this delegation, much of the discussion about future interest rates concerned political factors. Afterwards, the discourse focused much more on economic factors. That greater clarity and certainty arguably yielded a better benefit in the form of a lower risk premium in long-term interest rates. Similar considerations motivate the delegation of pricing of essential facilities, independent regulation using the well-tried principles of the regulatory asset base, can encourage long-term investment by the private sector without an undue risk premium being required, and will result in direct benefits to consumers in the form of lower prices, hence the form of regulation in energy, water, transport and parts of telecoms. The economics literature formalises this as the issue of time inconsistency. Government may determine an optimal policy path, but the passage of time alone renders the original path suboptimal. Without some form of commitment to the original path, government will renege and re-optimise. But that reneging will be anticipated by intelligent agents, and that anticipation leads to a severely suboptimal outcome. Delegation of powers carried out in the right way can provide a mechanism for pre-commitment that overcomes this problem. And it's that which motivated much of my macroeconomic academic research, focused on finding ways to design robust, simple macro policy rules. And robust and effective delegation mechanisms are the equivalent challenge at the sector level. Fourth, delegation to independent regulators may well allow the regulator to build up a much greater concentration of sector and technical expertise than is possible within central government. While it would be wrong to overstate the point, the typical career development of the central civil service is one of rotation from one area to another, and therefore tends to encourage general administrative skills over technical skills. An independent regulator may well be able to attract and retain a stronger body of technical expertise with benefits for the quality of regulation. This applies to the competition area as well as to sector regulators. And fifth, but importantly, there may be matters seen to be of legitimate public concern in which government should not itself intervene. The obvious example is content issues in the media. It's long been accepted there is content that is within the law, but the dissemination of which should be controlled. In broadcast media, regulators, now Ofcom, have enforced standards for accuracy and impartiality and to avoid harm and offence, though one has to say with increasing difficulty in a world of proliferating channels. These are standards that are over and above what the law itself requires. Given the sensitivity of these issues, government has preferred this to be done independently and at a distance. Much of the controversy over the Leveson inquiry, which I was privileged to participate in, centred on the case for similar standards in the print media. Finally, any satisfactory regulatory arrangement needs a strong and robust appeals system, either to independent tribunals or the courts, or in the competition area, parts of regulatory decisions appealed to the CMA. And such appeals are an essential part of a healthy regime. But without delegation of decisions to independent agencies, the government may well find itself mired in a set of appeals and challenges that weaken its broader authority to the detriment of its overall effectiveness. So I think these reasons provide a powerful case for the delegation of a number of key areas of decision-making to an independent regulator. The broad shape of that delegation has now evolved into a well-established structure. Government, through Parliament, sets out in statute the duties and powers of the regulator, as well as its governance structure. Appointment of those charged to exercise these powers in the discharge of the duties is by government, though at least in the UK with some independence of the process. They then exercise their powers in the way they judge appropriate, and they're held to account by public scrutiny, including from select committees and usually by appeal to the courts or specialist tribunals. Although that broad shape is similar, there are important differences across different areas of delegation. Some, notably the Monetary Policy Committee, have a very clear and simple objectives, while others, notably the sector economic regulators, have long shopping lists of objectives. Powers also vary appreciably. That's why all sector economic regulators now have, or shortly will have, concurrent Competition Act and Enterprise Act powers. That's only relatively recent. While the model of collective board responsibility is now quite general, that too is relatively recent. And the way in which particular interests, the industry, consumers and devolved nations, are represented or not in the board structure varies very considerably. These differences partly arose from differences in the nature of the devolved task, but in large part they reflect the fact that much regulation sprang from government departmental initiatives at different times without any overall and consistent regulatory philosophy. And playing into all of this is, of course, the framework of European law, which varies in its force across sectors. A crucial design question is just what is delegated to the regulator and what retained for government. And there's considerable variation across different areas. Delegation of interest rate setting to the Bank of England was straightforward and clear, but government retains the power to change the inflation target, as indeed it has done once. In the field of sector regulation, the need to put such delegation in statute has led to ever more complex legislation, and sometimes to rather surprising results. Thus, Ofcom, in practice, negotiates on behalf of Her Majesty's Government in international agreements on spectrum, but somewhat surprisingly has no national security duty, despite the centrality of telecoms to security matters. Central to these arrangements is the independence of the regulator. Effective regulation needs to be independent of both the industry and government, but at the same time it requires a thorough understanding of the regulated industry and sensitivity to political currents. And independence is also earned through the quality of the analysis, insights, and solutions that the regulator offers, and earned through the long-term benefits delivered to consumers. Of course, the regulator suffers from an asymmetry of information. The regulated firms will inevitably know far more about their business than the regulator. But through careful research and analysis, the regulator can know more about the industry as a whole and how it works than the individual firms within it. And that, in my view, is a key to the regulator's reputation and authority. Where there's a perception that this insight is lacking, then the authority will wane. And one of the great strengths, I believe, of the British competition regime is its long and distinguished track record. The quality of analysis and actions that's flowed from the Office of Fair Trade and Competition Commission has earned respect and understanding for the benefits of allowing the regulatory process to run its course. This broad delegated structure of regulation is well understood both in the UK and internationally, and indeed represents a key British policy export, both within Europe and more widely. This provides both stability and assurance to business and helps make the UK an attractive place for international investors. Within Europe, there's been a very considerable drive towards independent regulation as a means of creating a genuine internal market, achieving a more consistent and vigorous application of EU-wide rules without regard to national preference. The EU regimes for telecoms and energy illustrate this well. And just two sectors illustrate the long-run benefits of letting competition work. Telecoms, where data costs have plummeted, fueling the digital economy and the UK's strength in e-commerce, and air transport, which has been transformed by new entrants with new innovative business models. The competition regime, now overseen by the CMA, illustrates the considerable benefits of a delegated structure very well. The UK regime has evolved over the past few decades from a market and merger regime where governments, driven by poorly defined public interest considerations, could influence outcomes, to one where the regime is independent, respected, with a considerable body of case law, and where wider public interest considerations, as opposed to a focus on effects of competition, apply only in clearly defined and limited areas. And with this evolution has come a widespread acceptance across political parties that competition is generally to be welcomed. There is always the temptation for governments to want to influence specific outcomes, but the politicians of all stripes need to bear in mind at all times the costs of so doing and why the regime has evolved in the way that it has. While there may be political attractions for intervening in particular cases, the long-term costs are potentially considerable and widespread, if not so obviously tangible. Political interventions often have undesired side effects and most certainly damage the credibility of the regime, raising uncertainty for business and reducing the attractions of investing at home, and thereby not failing to deliver the consumer benefits that come from a vigorous and dynamic market. And domestic interventions may well be copied internationally, raising the barriers and costs for British business operating internationally. The better route is to work with the institutions that successive governments have created and developed, and where appropriate to find constructive and beneficial adjustments to the regime. That may be done through legislation, as we've seen, I believe, in the competition and consumer area with the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act. And as I argued elsewhere, that represented a judicious adjustment and enhancement to the competition and consumer regime, and one that will, I think, be seen as a significant strengthening of it. It requires us to operate to shorter timescales needed in a fast-moving world. It gives us some additional powers of investigation, and it enables us to conduct more focused inquiries on market issues that span sectors. Three particular features of the reform are relevant to my broader theme. The first is that the legislation requires government to give the CMA a high-level strategic steer. Some have pointed to the strategic steer that government has given us as a weakening of our independence, and I could not disagree more strongly. It's important that any regulator, as I've said, including the Competition Authority, is sensitive to both political currents and commercial realities. And it's important that there is a continued dialogue between the regulator and government, as well as other stakeholders, on a no surprises, no veto basis. The strategic steer makes that high-level communication, which otherwise would be covert, open and transparent. And that's very consistent with the current government's principles for economic regulation, which suggests that a strategy and policy statement can be a way of aligning regulation with the broad thrust of government policy while maintaining regulatory independence. In our case, the CMA must have regard to the steer, but is not bound by it. And were we to be steered to an issue which we judged to be without a substance, then the CMA would be obliged to explain in public why we had reached that view. That's the transparent way that independence would be asserted. Given the high level and well-positioned nature of the current steer, I'd be very surprised if that were necessary. And I see the strategic steer as an effective and helpful way for government to hone the framework of delegation laid down in legislation. It is, however, important to note the risks if the steer moves from the strategic to being too prescriptive and detailed. That hasn't happened, and nor do I think it will happen, given the economy-wide role that the CMA plays as recognised by all parties during the passage of recent legislation. But governments can go too far in prescribing courses for regulators and independent bodies to take, and can, as King and Crewe note, fail to engage with the practical implications of implementation. For example, it's now recognised by all parties that the energy sector, which has particular political salience at the present time, involves trade-offs between domestic prices, investment in supply, environmental concerns and other issues. But as Tim Tutton has recently suggested, under the previous government, the early social and environmental guidance to Ofgem in 2004, following the 2003 Energy White Paper, was both more detailed on the key issues of decarbonisation, security of supply, competition and affordability, and rather blithely suggested there were no trade-offs to be addressed. Thus, and I quote, "The government has not sought to rank the four objectives set out in the White Paper. It's the government's view that these objectives can be achieved together, and the government has put in place policies designed to achieve this." Policy making of this kind, prescribing detailed aims without considering whether they're feasible and achievable, leaves the regulator open to blame and is the punch bag when things don't work out. But with strong analysis and intellectual courage, the regulator can inform the public policy debate to make clear what the inherent trade-offs and the limits of the possible may be. The second important feature of the recent competition reforms is the greatly enhanced competition concurrency regime in the regulated sectors. A concern expressed by government and others about the UK competition regime has been the relative paucity of competition cases in the regulated sectors. These are sectors that account for some 25% of the economy, and therefore really rather important. They're also typically characterized by monopolistic or oligopolistic market structures. This might suggest the need for more rather than less competition enforcement than in other parts of the economy, hence the concern. But despite having concurrent powers, the OFT was reluctant to get drawn into consideration of these sectors. The CMA, by contrast, is tasked with taking the lead in coordinating competition actions in the regulated sectors and will cooperate with sector regulators in the regulated sectors, with sector regulators through the newly formed UK Competition Network. And the new Act, by strengthening the requirement for regulators before they exercise their direct regulatory powers, to consider whether it would be more appropriate to exercise competition powers, is intended to make more likely the adoption of pro-competition outcomes in these sectors. Greater reliance on markets and competition will place less burden on regulation to safeguard consumer interests, and that recalls Stephen Littletide's famous quote of 1983, "Competition is indisputably the most effective, perhaps the only effective means of protecting consumers against monopoly power. Regulation is essentially the means of preventing the worst excesses of monopoly. It's not a substitute for competition. It's a means of holding the fort until competition comes." Well, we've been holding the fort for quite a while in a number of sectors. The third aspect is the role that the CMA is asked to play in acting as an advocate for competition within government as part of our wider advocacy role. This is something the OFT has done in the past, but we're required to do more actively. A number of competition issues arise from decisions made within governments, by departments addressing key policy issues and inadvertently in the process doing things that impede competition. That's happened with privatisation and with the opening by government of new markets. And there's an important role for the CMA to act as an advocate for competition, to design policies before implementation that are as friendly as possible to competition, rather than having to sweep up the problems afterwards. Some of that work will be in public, and there's now an important obligation on government departments to accept CMA recommendations or explain their contrary reasoning to the highest levels of government. Some of this work will be behind the scenes, so you may not hear a lot about it, but it may well prove to be as important a part of the CMA's work as those much more in the public eye. These last 2 points lead me to my concluding theme for this lecture. The CMA's primary duty, laid down in the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, is to promote competition both within and outside the United Kingdom for the benefit of consumers. The slightly surprising reference to outside the UK is not some imperialist throwback, but rather an endorsement of the important international dimensions to our work, recognising that true competition traverses boundaries. Our overall mission is to make markets work well in the interests of consumers, businesses and the economy. This echoes the OFT's mission, but expands on it. It mentions the interests of business, not to set those interests against those of consumers, the focus of our primary duty. Rather, it's because open, well-functioning markets are very much in the interests of efficient, innovative and fair-dealing businesses as well as consumers. And it mentions the economy because of the centrality of effective competition to the longer-term growth and innovation performance of the economy. How best to deliver benefits to consumers is not always obvious. I well remember that early on during our strategic review of telecoms, consumer groups criticised Ofcom for focusing on the consumers, not focusing on the companies, not focusing on the consumers. And it was perfectly true that we focused on the interconnect arrangements between BT and other suppliers. But that was what was required to get the market working properly. Once fixed, effective competition drove down prices and drove up broadband take-up with huge consumer benefit. Making markets work better through competition is the surest way to achieve our central goal. The CMA delivers on this mission to deliver benefits to consumers in 2 important ways: enforcing competition and consumer law to ensure that harmful and illegal behaviour is punished and deterred, and by using our broad powers to make markets that are performing poorly work better for consumers and business. A key set of tools at our disposal for the latter are the market studies and market inquiries. Market studies are the phase 1 tool deployed hitherto by the Office of Fair Trading and may lead to changes in market practice through agreed undertakings as a consequence of the investigation, or may lead to a referral to phase 2 market inquiry, hitherto undertaken by the Competition Commission. The key point about these market tools is that there is no presumption that anyone is behaving illegally, though an inquiry may uncover such behaviour, but simply that the market is not working well and can be improved. And the Enterprise Act gave the Competition Commission the power to impose proportionate and appropriate remedies to improve market performance, and that power has now passed to the CMA. This is a very powerful tool and one that's widely admired around the world. Its importance is highlighted by several themes that I've touched on in this lecture. First, at this point that while markets represent the most effective way to organise complex and dispersed economic activity, markets don't always work well. And that may be because there are impediments such as entry barriers to competition. It may also be because competition takes a malign form, with businesses competing to gouge rather than serve customers. And second, there's the important point that designing market interventions that enhance market performance is a complex, difficult, and time-consuming task, and one that's best done calmly and out of the political spotlight. And that's particularly so because it requires a lot of careful analysis to avoid interventions that have unconsidered consequences. A graphic example of some of these points is provided by that maestro financial storyteller, Michael Lewis, in his latest book, Flash Boys. I can't comment on the veracity of all that he says, but it has a ring of truth that makes it worth recounting, since it shows the law of unintended consequences at work. In 2005, Congress was concerned to block the practice of front trading, whereby those executing a financial trade on behalf of an investing client could trade in advance, thereby benefiting from the market price adjustment that the commissioned trade would induce. To do so, they passed Reg NMS, which Lewis describes as well-meaning and sensible, in which if market participants abided by its spirit, would have established a new fairness in US financial markets. Lewis says that instead, it institutionalized a more pernicious inequality. How did this happen? It replaced the notion of best execution with the tight legal concept of best price, defined by the concept of a national best bid and offer. And in practice, this had unforeseen consequences. The strict definition of a best price meant that somebody executing a $100 million trade on behalf of an investment fund would have to look first at the price on offer for a $10 trade, if that was the lowest, and then move up the price gradient, irrespective of block size on offer. Of course, all this can be done automatically and almost instantaneously, and common sense would suggest that it would be of no consequence and would assure the best possible deal for the trader's client. But of course, in matters of this kind, common sense is often a poor guide. The unforeseen consequence was to create a race for speed, measured in microseconds, a tiny fraction of a blink of an eye. If I post a low offer of $10 worth of stock, I'll get first information about a major trade. If I can then use that information to beat the trader to their next best and subsequent trades, I can front run on a massive scale. I've got a better chance of doing that if I'm allowed to set up inside the exchange. So I have a head start. Even better, if in the name of competition, I'm able to establish an exchange some distance from the others, but with an ultra-fast private link back to the other exchanges. Then I can lure the ordinary trader to remote spots where they have no chance at all of beating me on the return journey. And even better still, if I don't actually have to execute the trade at the price that's lured my victim to the outback, because the rules of my exchange allow me to retract the offer, allowing for entirely costless bait. Now, that's a wonderful story that Michael Lewis describes. I can't vouch for the truth of it all, because it's under a major investigation anyway by several leading financial regulators. But even if a small part of it is true, it's a major scandal. Close to 2/3 of trade on US financial markets are now accounted for by high-frequency trading. And if Lewis is right, returns to ordinary financial investors, including the insurance and pension funds we all rely on, are correspondingly depressed. The counter-argument that high-speed trading helps market liquidity would seem to be a nonsense. Holding a stock for a microsecond and ending every trading day with no position provides very little liquidity of any meaningful kind to markets. It would have had John Hicks, that doyen of monetary economics who did so much to define and refine the concept of liquidity, spinning in his grave. It illustrates, I think, this point, the key point, that well-intentioned regulation may have perverse consequences. While many may put effort into compliance, there will be those who will find a way to avoid and profit. And it also illustrates another point, that not necessarily an increase in competition, in this case through proliferation of competing exchanges, may not always be benign. But promoting effective competition on a fair basis is likely to be the best way to improve outcomes for consumers. But it may require more than just that. The payday loan market has many competing providers, but the OFT referred that market to a phase 2 market inquiry, still in progress, because it suspected that this competition was working to the disadvantage of vulnerable consumers. Despite the fact that there are 6 large competing energy companies, the level of dissatisfaction with the operation of that market is high, and one of among several reasons why, following the joint OFT CMA Ofgem competition assessment, Ofgem is consulting on whether to refer the energy market to a phase 2 inquiry. In some cases, behavioural remedies may be the right way to go, as the Competition Commission judged in its inquiry into the audit market. In others, structural remedies in the form of divestment may be appropriate. The breakup of BAA by the Competition Commission has led to much improved customer experience at London airports. Similar divestment is being required in the London private hospital market. And in some cases, a package may be called for. Although structural separation of BT was considered in the early days of Ofcom, and indeed proposed by me before becoming chairman, the end solution of functional separation was a hybrid. Some organisational change, but as importantly, behavioural changes, overseen by appropriate governance and audit. There is no science to the devising of remedies that improve failings in markets, but which avoid adverse side effects. But there's no substitute for deep, considered analysis, so that remedies are based on a sound understanding of how a market operates and focused on the features that need adjusting. And that takes time. I remember my former London Business School colleague, Paul Jarosky, a very fine industrial economist who was a deputy chairman and then chairman of the Competition Commission for a very tragically short time before his very early death. I remember him describing to me the thrill he got from a deep immersion in a market and coming to understand exactly how it works. That takes time, diligence, objectivity and independence. And that's what has underpinned the reputations of the Office of Fair Trading and Competition Commission, and that's what the CMA is determined to uphold. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this roller coaster of 30 years of regulation from early days to Flash Boys. So now it's up to you. So any questions you may have for the speaker. There will be 2 microphones moving around the room. So maybe we can start with the gentleman there.
David, you eloquently set out the British model of independent regulation, which we have. How come the press have managed to get away with rebuffing any attempt at any sort of statutory regulation, including backstop regulation, and being sort of uncompliant with Leveson? Either we have independent regulation, but they're asserting we have government regulation. Could you comment on that?
You may have noticed that Brian Leveson took a sort of vow of silence having delivered his 2,000-page report and hasn't commented on any aspect of it because he thinks, as a judge, he thinks he's delivered his verdict, people can read it and make the most of it. And we, the advisors, are under a similar vow of silence on the matter. All I would say is we worked very hard to work to find a way in which the statutory element in press regulation was the absolute minimum and would not be directly influencing, making decisions on content in the press. It was a form of self-regulation, but with some degree, an element of oversight to make sure it was meeting certain minimum standards. Because the trouble with self-regulation is it's inclined to become lowest common denominator regulator, and that's not very satisfactory. We worked hard to do that. What was proposed by Leveson, however, was not where we seem to have ended up with a Royal Charter arrangement, and that's a very different model from the one that he advocated. You can speculate for yourselves as to what the political processes that led us to that point. But a part of it was people didn't read the 2,000 pages before they made up their minds.
David Edmonds, I'm sorry you didn't think I handed over you a better deal when I left 5 years running Oftel and joined you on the Ofcom board, but it's not a question I want to ask tonight. Basically, I think a really powerful exposition for independent regulation. I wonder, though, David, whether at this time you feel that from the political dimension there is any threat to the independence that you, others, have worked to secure over the last 20 years by either robust leadership as a chair of a board or the independent directors general or the way in which things have developed. Because over the last few years we've had the Cabinet Office which has been saying there's too much regulation, roll it back. It doesn't seem to have got very far. I mean, is there a threat that you perceive from your long experience?
I think there is a I mean, the reason for speaking as I have tonight is that I do think there is a risk, particularly in the year we're going to be in run-up to election, where political interventions, political statements, political commitments are made that are populist, but actually aren't really in the long run benefit of consumers, and that risk undoubtedly has to be there. We need to guard against it. And I think all of us who are working in the regulatory sphere and those who are working in government need to be putting the arguments, which I hope I set out, as to why this system has evolved and why it is there as it is. Successive generations of politicians need to be reminded that having all the controls in their hands is not necessarily their interest, because that has disadvantages. And this system has evolved for very good reasons. But of course, short-term considerations can override. And I mean, Ofcom was threatened with abolition before the last election. Fortunately, that didn't materialise. Noises have been made with regard to Ofgem. I think it's incumbent on us all to actually be arguing as to why this system has merit, and arguing it equally internationally. Because if you look at the international scene and say the competition area or in other areas of sector regulation, you find quite a variation across Europe and particularly outside Europe. And it's clearly in the benefits, the long-term benefits of business operating internationally and ultimately consumers, that system is generalised and strengthened. I mean, the encouraging thing about the competition areas, I mean, I was at a conference in Marrakesh a few weeks ago at the International Competition Network. Somebody has to do these things. And I mean, there are 119 countries represented in the International Competition Network. That represents quite a lot of new regimes in a number of countries, including China. And I think that development, we need to be conscious that it's not just a UK thing, it is an international development.
It's very interesting. I may just quickly come back. I mean, I've been regulating lawyers for the last 6 years, and God help me, that's worse than BT. But the Secretary of State for Justice in the summer of last year decided to have a call for evidence on the working of the regulatory system. And that was actually as a response to moaning and whinging by lawyers. 6-7 months of study produced absolutely no change whatsoever. So setting out the facts, doing the analysis, making the arguments, I think can work, and I think you're absolutely correct. All of those involved in it have got to go on pursuing it.
We have time, I think, for one more question, maybe a couple more. And then
Thank you. Simon Kahn. I just thought I'd uphold the monopoly of the microphone remaining in this corner of the building. I just wanted to take you up, David, on your point about holding the fort, that regulation is there holding the fort until competition arrives. And then you added your own, that was the little child quote, and then you added your own words, we're still waiting for competition to arrive. And I just wanted to tease out that a little bit more, because in markets that are highly competitive, you may get price control, effective prices, but you get all sorts of other sorts of abuses. Mis-selling. We see it in financial services. We've seen it just recently with the fine of one of the electricity retail companies, I forget which one, for mis-selling. So the point of my question is that when there's competition, regulation is still needed. It's just a different sort of regulation. So what I'm really wondering is, are we really in a state where we're waiting for the competition to arrive, or have we arrived at a place where regulation has matured to handle what is needed, where there is competition and it's a different form of regulation?
I mean, you clearly do need a framework for consumer protection to make sure there aren't abuses in markets. And so the notion that regulation is altogether going to disappear, I think you're absolutely right, that's not going to happen. I used to have that dream about Ofcom, and there's not a lot of sign of that of it coming. But I do think there is advantage in trying to move these markets to have more players. I think it's the diversity of players, of business models, that allows experimentation. The other little child quote about Austrian economics and rivalrous discovery, I think, is a very important aspect of markets. And having different players experimenting, doing different things, allows us to find out what are the best ways of doing things in a way that tends not to happen when economic activity is monopolized. I think that's the real benefit of getting those market processes working for the better. And we haven't made as much progress as I think we should have done. And it will be a challenge over the next few years to get the UKCN, the UK Competition Network, to start delivering those benefits on a better scale.
very last question.
Thank you. Glenn Sexton, CAS alumnus. A few weeks ago, I was sitting pretty much in this similar place talking about banking regulation. And the comment was made that the average bank board spends on average 70% of its time discussing regulation, which made me wonder whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. Perhaps you might like to comment on that. But the other thing, we talked a little bit about the balance between politics and activity, as it were. And I get a little bit worried about this word independent, because yes, it looks like a good buffer between the inexpert government and the reality, but can't it become, on the other hand, a means of insulating the politicians from all the nasty decisions, and possibly giving them a shelter in order to introduce nice decisions, inverted commas, of their own? I just wonder if there are two conflicting conflicting pulls there, one between protecting the politician and the other one giving them an extra way of influencing events, but at the same time putting the operators like the banks into a state where they begin to try to game the system.
Yes, I mean, a lot of complex questions there. I mean, firstly, I don't use the word independence in a very naive way. I mean, I'm conscious that independence has to be earned, that you have to be sensitive to commercial realities. You need to have independence from the sector, but be sensitive to it. And similarly, you have to work with the grain of government policy. And so it's entirely appropriate that the ministers understand what regulatory developments are, even though it's clear that the decisions are made independently by an independent board. And I think there's great merit in that, and I think there's great merit in also, therefore, the consequence of that, which is that if the politicians want to change things, they've got to think through a structured form of reform, rather than intervening in a particular aspect, in a particular intervention that is not really within a consistent framework of intervention. So I think there's merit in this arrangement, because I think you're right, it does allow politicians to be distanced from decisions, but there are quite a lot of decisions where that's a very good thing. Not least, in setting the price trajectory for an essential facility. If the politicians have their way on that, that's not going to give any investors certainties. It's not going to give an efficient outcome. I think the way the system has evolved is therefore a good one. The complexity of banking regulation and the fact that bank boards have to spend so much time worried about it is, I suppose, a concern. I suppose I have the opposite concern. I don't think it's the case in the UK boards that enough thought is given to the responsibilities under competition and consumer protection law. And I think more awareness. My ambition would be to have competition issues being as of much salience to major boards as, say, the Bribery Act. And I think, because I think it's important that we do have a greater consciousness of what is and is not appropriate in the competition and consumer protection world. That's not a very adequate answer to what was a complex question, but it gives you a sense of where I'm coming from.
So let's thank again Lord Currie. And any other questions, there will be opportunity outside with drinks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.